The French coast was dark, but it was not sleeping. Along the Loire estuary, German guns waited in concrete positions. Searchlights could sweep the water in seconds. Anti-aircraft batteries watched the sky. Harbour defences watched the river. St Nazaire was not a soft target. It was one of the most important naval points on the Atlantic coast of occupied France. And somewhere out in the Black Water, a strange British force was coming in. It was not a great invasion fleet. It was not protected by battleships. It was not the kind of attack the German command would have expected from a nation still recovering from Dunkirk, the Blitz, and years of pressure at sea. It was a battered old destroyer, a handful of small wooden craft, Royal Navy crews, and British commandos packed with explosives, weapons, and a plan so dangerous that survival was never guaranteed. The Germans would soon see the ship. They would fire at it. They would board it. They would inspect it. And by the time some of them understood what the British had really done, it would be too late. Before this story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This is not just a story about a raid. It is a story about the kind of British courage that did not ask for comfort, did not expect applause, and did not wait for perfect odds. To understand why St Nazaire mattered, it is necessary to understand the fear behind it. In early 1942, Nazi Germany still threatened the Atlantic lifeline. Britain depended on the sea. Food, fuel, weapons, men, machines, and hope crossed dangerous waters under constant threat from submarines, aircraft, raiders, and warships. The Atlantic was not just a battlefield, it was Britain's artery. If that artery was cut, Britain could be starved. One German battleship cast a long shadow over British planning. Tirpitz, sister ship of Bismarck, was a massive threat. Bismarck had already shown what a modern German battleship could do when it broke into the Atlantic. The Royal Navy had hunted her down and destroyed her, but the lesson was not forgotten. A single powerful enemy warship could force convoys to scatter, draw British ships away from other duties, and create panic across the shipping lanes. Tirpitz was too valuable for Germany to risk carelessly. But if she ever did break into the Atlantic and suffer damage, she would need somewhere large enough to repair her. On the Atlantic coast, there was one dock that mattered above all others. The Normandie Dock at St Nazaire. It was huge. It had been built for great ocean liners, not for modest ships. It was the only dry dock on the occupied Atlantic coast large enough to take a vessel like Tirpitz. If that dock remained usable, German naval planners had options. If it was destroyed, Tirpitz would be forced to operate with far less freedom. That was the British calculation. Not glamorous, not simple, but brutally strategic. Destroy the dock, and the German battleship threat becomes harder to use. Leave it intact, and the Royal Navy must continue planning around a nightmare. Bombing was considered, but the target was difficult. Precision bombing at night was still uncertain. Heavy attacks could hit the town and civilians without guaranteeing the destruction of the dock gates and machinery. A naval assault seemed almost impossible. St Nazaire was deep inside enemy-held territory, guarded, watched, defended, and protected by distance as much as guns. That was why the idea was so audacious. The British would not merely bomb the dock, they would sail into it. The operation was given the code name Chariot. The main weapon would be HMS Campbeltown, an old destroyer from an earlier age of war. She was not chosen because she was beautiful or modern. She was chosen because she could be sacrificed. British planners stripped her down, altered her profile, and packed her with explosives hidden deep inside. Her task was simple to describe and almost suicidal to perform. She had to steam up the Loire estuary under enemy fire and ram the dock gates. Then, hours later, the explosives inside her would detonate. The commandos had their own mission. They would land in the chaos, destroy dock machinery, pumping systems, bridges, gates, and other key installations, then withdraw by sea if they could. That final phrase mattered, if they could. The raiding force was a combined operation involving the Royal Navy and Army commandos. Commander Robert Ryder led the naval side. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Holden Beatty commanded Campbeltown. Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman commanded the commandos ashore. These were not men planning a symbolic gesture. They were planning a surgical strike against a fortified port, knowing that many of the men under their command might never return. The German defenders were not careless amateurs. They had coastal guns, searchlights, harbour defences, troops, and the advantage of fighting from prepared positions. They were protecting a valuable base. They understood that St Nazaire mattered, but they did not understand everything. They did not understand that the old destroyer coming towards them was not merely a ship. She was a delayed explosion. In the night, the British force moved towards the coast. The journey itself was full of danger. The vessels were vulnerable. The smaller craft were lightly built and exposed. Petrol, wood, ammunition, and men were packed into boats that could be shredded by heavy fire. The men knew that once they entered the estuary, there would be little room for error and almost no room for mercy. The sea did not offer protection forever. As the force approached St Nazaire, deception played its part. The British used recognition signals and confusion to buy precious moments. But deception in war rarely lasts long. German suspicion hardened. Searchlights found shapes on the water. Guns began to speak. Then the night exploded. Shells and tracer fire tore across the estuary. The small craft were terrifyingly exposed. Men crouched behind thin protection while rounds smashed into timber and steel. Some boats burned. Some were hit before they could land their commandos. Others struggled through smoke, water, and fire, trying to reach their assigned points. Campbeltown drove on. The ship was hit repeatedly. The men aboard were under direct fire from close range. The bridge became a place of death and decision, but Beatty held her on course. The destroyer had one purpose now. She was not there to survive. She was there to strike. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, Campbeltown rammed the southern gate of the Normandie Dock. The impact drove her bow into the structure. For a moment, the impossible had happened. A British destroyer was lodged inside the gate of one of the most important German-held docks in Europe. The commandos began to move. This is where the popular image of commandos can mislead people. It is easy to imagine them as effortless heroes, silent and invincible, men who simply appear from darkness and win. St Nazaire was not like that. It was confusion, noise, fire, smoke, smashed boats, wounded men, missed landing points, blocked routes, and objectives that still had to be destroyed despite the plan breaking apart around them. That is what German officers realized too late. The British commandos were not dangerous because everything went perfectly. They were dangerous because they kept acting when almost nothing did. Demolition parties moved with explosives towards their targets. Protection teams fought to keep them alive. Assault teams cleared paths where they could. The work was brutally practical. Destroy this machinery, blow that bridge, disable that gate. Prevent the dock from functioning even if Campbeltown failed to do enough damage. The men were not fighting for ground they could hold. They were fighting for minutes. Minutes for the demolition teams, minutes for the explosives, minutes for the dock to die. German resistance stiffened quickly. The defenders were alert now. Their fire cut through the raiding force. Many of the small craft that were supposed to evacuate the commandos were destroyed, burning, disabled, or driven away. The planned withdrawal by sea began to collapse. For many commandos ashore, the raid had become something even harsher than intended. They had entered a fortified enemy port. They had damaged their targets. Now they had to escape through an occupied town with ammunition running low and German forces closing in. Lieutenant Colonel Newman understood the reality. His commandos could not simply wait at the waterfront for boats that were no longer coming. The men had to break out in small groups and try to reach the countryside. From there, perhaps some might make their way through France, across Spain, and eventually back to Britain. It was a desperate hope, but desperate hope was still hope. We've reached halfway, and if this story is already showing you why St Nazaire became legendary, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with where you are watching from. Stories like this deserve to be remembered not as simple myths, but as the hard truth of what men did under impossible pressure. By the time dawn came, St Nazaire was full of smoke, wreckage, dead, wounded, prisoners, and rumors. For the German officers inspecting the scene, it may have looked as though the main British effort had already failed in one sense. The attackers had paid a dreadful price. Many were dead, many were captured. The small craft had been devastated. The commandos who had not escaped were being rounded up. The old destroyer was stuck in the dock gate, damaged and silent. To the eye, Campbeltown looked like a wreck, but that was the point. The British had built the operation around a weapon that looked harmless once its visible fighting was over. The explosives hidden inside Campbeltown were not meant to detonate immediately. They were delayed. The ship was a trap made of steel, sacrifice, and timing. German personnel gathered around her. Some inspected the ship, others studied the damage. The mood among some defenders may have included relief, curiosity, and professional interest. They had fought off the raiders. They had captured many of them. The port had survived the night. But the British plan had not finished. It was waiting. When Campbeltown exploded later that morning, the blast tore through the dock gate and killed many of those nearby. The Normandie Dock was wrecked. The very facility the raid had been designed to destroy was put out of action for the rest of the war. That was the realization that came too late. The British had not needed to occupy St Nazaire. They had not needed to defeat every defender. They had not needed to bring every man home. They had needed to deny Germany the dock, and they had done it. The cost was terrible. Of the men who set out, only a minority returned directly to Britain. 169 were killed. 215 became prisoners of war. A few made extraordinary escapes with help from French civilians and resistance networks. The dead included sailors and commandos, men from different services, bound together by a mission that asked almost everything from them. It is important not to make the sacrifice neat. War is often remembered in clean phrases, but the reality was not clean. Men burned in boats, men drowned, men fought wounded. Men surrendered when ammunition was gone. Men entered captivity not as failures, but as survivors of a task almost designed to consume them. The Victoria Crosses awarded after the raid tell part of the story, but not all of it. Beatty, Ryder, Newman, Sergeant Thomas Durrant, and able seaman William Savage became names attached to extraordinary gallantry. Durrant and Savage did not live to receive the honour. Many others received decorations. Many received no decoration at all, except memory. That is often the way of war. A medal can mark courage. It cannot contain it. The German command had understood British naval power. It had understood British stubbornness. It had understood that commandos were dangerous raiders. But at St Nazaire, German officers encountered something more difficult to measure: a British willingness to turn an obsolete destroyer into a strategic weapon, to send men into a fortified port at night, and to accept a terrible price for a result that might shape the wider war. The raid did not sink Tirpitz. It did not end the Battle of the Atlantic. It did not make Britain safe overnight. History should not be exaggerated into fantasy, but it removed a vital repair option from Germany's Atlantic coast. It forced German naval planning into narrower channels. It showed that the British, even under pressure, could strike with imagination and violence at a place the enemy believed was secure. It also proved something about combined operations. Britain had learned painful lessons from earlier failures. Amphibious warfare was complicated. Coordination between sea, land, and air was difficult. Small mistakes could become fatal. St Nazaire was not perfect. It was costly, chaotic, and in many human ways disastrous. Yet it achieved its central objective. That combination is what makes it so powerful. Not clean victory, costly success. The British commandos at St Nazaire were not supermen. They were trained men, frightened men, disciplined men, stubborn men. Some were very young, some were experienced. Some had families waiting. Some probably knew, as the coast came closer, that the odds of returning were shrinking with every mile. But they went in. There is a kind of courage that looks loud from a distance. Flags, speeches, music, cheering crowds. St Nazaire was not that kind. It was a man gripping a weapon in a small boat while shells landed around him. It was a sailor staying at his post as a destroyer charged towards a dock gate. It was a demolition party carrying explosives through a port that had become a killing ground. It was a commander making decisions while the plan broke apart in front of him. It was the cold acceptance that the mission mattered more than escape. The German officers who inspected Campbeltown saw a wreck. What they did not see soon enough was the full shape of British intent. They saw damage. They did not see patience. They saw prisoners. They did not see victory already ticking beneath the deck. They saw an old ship. They did not understand that Britain had turned that old ship into a message. The message was not that Britain was invincible. Britain had suffered too much for that illusion. The message was that Britain could still reach across dark water into a defended enemy port and break something the enemy believed it could protect. That is why St Nazaire still matters. It belongs to the history of the Royal Navy, the Commandos, combined operations, and the wider British war effort. It belongs to the men who returned and the men who did not. It belongs also to the French civilians who lived under occupation and saw in the smoke and chaos proof that the enemy's grip on Europe was not permanent. And it belongs to a particular British tradition of war. Not always polished, not always perfect, but capable of astonishing nerve when the hour demands it. The raid was daring, but daring alone would not have been enough. It required planning. It required intelligence. It required seamanship. It required engineers who understood what to destroy. It required commandos trained to keep moving through confusion. It required sailors willing to take small craft into fire that no small craft should have had to face. And above all, it required men who understood that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is continuing while fear is present. The dock at St Nazaire was eventually repaired after the war. The men were not. The families were not. The empty chairs remained empty. The names carved into memory did not return to ordinary life. That is why the story should never be told cheaply. It was not an adventure. It was not a game. It was a mission that worked because men paid for it with everything they had. When German officers realized what Campbeltown truly was, the realization came in fire, steel, and collapsing concrete. Too late to save the dock. Too late to reverse the guard. Too late to undo what British sailors and commandos had forced into history before dawn. St Nazaire became known as the greatest raid of all, not because it was painless, because it was almost impossible. And still, they went. If you watched until the end, write the word Campbeltown in the comments. Let it stand for the ship, the men, and the night when British courage entered a fortified harbour and left behind a silence the enemy could not repair.